In January 2014, the body of 18-year-old Heather Malone was discovered in the living room of a house in a Brookhaven, Georgia suburb. The investigation revealed disturbing details of her obsessive relationship with Nathan Ellis, a high school basketball coach. What began in the fall of 2013 at Brookhaven High School spiraled into jealousy, betrayal, and ultimately violence, leading to a night of devastating consequences. Nathan Ellis had always been a charismatic and respected figure in the community, admired not only by his players for his skills, but also for his genuine care in mentoring them. Nathan Ellis was living what many would consider a dream life. A college basketball star who transitioned smoothly into a successful coaching career, Nathan had quickly gained a reputation for being a dedicated coach and an approachable figure. He was well respected by his colleagues, players, and the community. In 2011, Nathan married his college sweetheart Hannah, a kind-hearted kindergarten teacher. The couple lived in a quaint 3-bedroom home on the outskirts of Brookhaven, nestled in a neighborhood known for its tight-knit community. They were in the early stages of planning a family, with Hannah recently discovering she was pregnant with their first child. Nathan's life seemed perfect. He spent his days coaching basketball, guiding young athletes, and his evenings with his wife. His commitment to both his marriage and his job created a harmonious balance in his life. As they worked on the nursery for their soon-to-arrive baby, Nathan and Hannah's love appeared to be the perfect example of happiness and stability. In stark contrast to Nathan's idyllic life, Heather Malone's upbringing was filled with instability and dysfunction. Growing up in a broken home, Heather's father had abandoned the family when she was just 10 years old, leaving her mother, Michelle, to struggle with alcoholism. Heather found herself neglected with little support or guidance at home. Her mother's inability to provide a stable environment pushed Heather to seek affection and validation elsewhere. Despite these challenges, Heather managed to maintain an outwardly cheerful and outgoing persona. As a cheerleader at Brookhaven High, she was popular among her peers and well-liked by teachers. However, beneath the surface, Heather was emotionally fragile. Her need for love and attention was insatiable, and she longed for someone to offer her the support and care that had been missing in her life. When she first encountered Nathan Ellis, she saw in him a figure who could provide the stability and affection she had always craved. The relationship between Nathan Ellis and Heather Malone began in a seemingly innocent and professional manner. In the fall of 2012, Nathan was in his first year as the head coach of the Brookhaven High School basketball team, a position he had worked hard to earn. He was a respected figure in the community, and students looked up to him not only for his basketball expertise, but also for his approachability and kindness. Heather, a cheerleader at the high school, had always admired Nathan from afar. She had been raised in a tumultuous environment where emotional neglect from her mother had left her starved for affection and attention. Heather, a charismatic and social young woman, had a strong desire to fit in and be admired, and Nathan's position as a mentor to many students made him a figure she looked up to. Their first interactions were casual, centered around basketball practices. Heather would often stay after practice, chatting with Nathan, asking for advice on schoolwork and life. At first, these conversations were entirely appropriate. Nathan was simply a mentor trying to help one of his students. However, as they continued to talk, Heather began to open up more about her troubled home life. Nathan, always kind and empathetic, listened to her and offered advice, not realizing how deeply Heather was becoming attached to him. Heather's feelings grew stronger as they continued to talk. She began seeking Nathan out more often, wanting to be near him, and soon their interactions became more frequent. She would come by his office after practice or text him, sometimes late into the night, about trivial matters. Nathan, who had always been a dedicated coach and teacher, responded in the same manner he would to any student, offering support and understanding. He had no reason to believe that Heather's feelings for him were anything other than the typical admiration a student might feel for a mentor. As the months passed, the boundaries of Nathan and Heather's relationship began to blur. Nathan, who had been a professional figure to Heather, started to notice subtle changes in her behavior. She would dress more provocatively at practices, lingering around after games and practices, making excuses to spend more time with him. Heather's requests for Nathan's attention became more persistent, and she would frequently find ways to contact him outside of school hours. Though Nathan initially tried to maintain a professional distance, he began to feel uncomfortable with the increasing frequency and intensity of their interactions. He noticed that Heather seemed to be pushing boundaries, texting him late at night and asking for personal advice that went beyond academic or sports-related topics. Despite this, Nathan didn't immediately address the situation, believing it was just a phase that would eventually pass. After all, Heather had never crossed any major lines, and he felt that his role as a mentor was important to her emotional well-being. However, as Heather's behavior became more overt, Nathan found himself in a more difficult position. She began to make comments that hinted at deeper feelings, asking him about his marriage and his personal life. She would compliment him excessively, sometimes making it clear that she saw him as more than just a coach. Nathan, who was trying to balance his professional and personal life, became increasingly uneasy, but he didn't take the necessary steps to address the situation head-on. He still saw Heather as a student who needed support, not as someone with an unhealthy emotional attachment. By early 2013, Heather was no longer content with the emotional connection she had with Nathan. She began to take more aggressive steps to push the relationship into more intimate territory, even though Nathan continued to maintain the facade of a professional boundary. At this point, Heather was no longer just a student seeking guidance. She had fallen into an obsessive state, convinced that Nathan was the answer to her emotional turmoil. In the spring of 2013, the relationship between Nathan Ellis and Heather Malone took a drastic turn when the emotional bond they shared transformed into a full-fledged affair. The moment it began was a mix of vulnerability and temptation. After a particularly stressful week during which Nathan struggled with mounting pressure at work and his own personal life, he found himself alone in the school gym after hours. Heather, emotional and distraught over unresolved issues at home, came to him for comfort. Nathan, always empathetic and kind, tried to console her. As the evening wore on, what started as a conversation of emotional support turned physical. The lines between their professional mentor-mentee relationship and personal feelings were crossed in an instant. At first, Nathan was overwhelmed with guilt. He tried to convince himself that this moment of weakness wouldn't lead to anything serious, but Heather was persistent and the affair deepened. Their meetings became more frequent, after school, in his office, even at secluded spots around town. Heather, eager for his attention, initiated many of these encounters. She expressed her feelings openly, telling Nathan that she had fallen deeply in love with him. Nathan, though he knew the affair was morally wrong, found it difficult to end things. He was struggling with his own emotions, which were complicated by his dissatisfaction with his marriage to Hannah and the pressure of his role as the school's basketball coach. For Heather, the affair became an obsession, while for Nathan, it was an emotional escape. Despite the secrecy, the affair was not without its complications. Heather's behavior began to shift from that of an adoring student to a more possessive lover. She insisted that their connection was special, that Nathan was the only person who understood her, and that their relationship was destined to be more than just a fling. Nathan, while still attached to his wife, began to question his feelings. The affair was an escape from the stress of his marriage and the responsibilities of his career, but it was a fleeting and dangerous one. Eventually, Nathan realized the magnitude of his actions. Though he was emotionally drawn to Heather, the guilt over betraying his wife was unbearable. He knew he had to put an end to it, but Heather's attachment had already run deep. Ending the affair would not be easy, and Nathan had underestimated just how far Heather was willing to go to keep him in her life. As the affair continued in secrecy, Heather's attachment to Nathan became more intense and consuming. What had started as admiration soon morphed into a dangerous obsession. She believed that Nathan was the only person who truly understood her, and her feelings for him grew beyond what she could control. Heather stopped seeing the affair as a temporary escape and instead began to view it as a permanent relationship. In her mind, she and Nathan were meant to be together, and no one, not even his wife Hannah, could stand in the way of their happiness. Her obsession led her to take more extreme actions to ensure Nathan's attention. She started showing up unannounced at basketball games and practices, even finding ways to appear at Nathan's office when he was working. She began texting him at all hours of the day and night, often sending multiple messages in a row when he didn't respond right away. These messages were often a mixture of love declarations and demands for more of his time. Nathan, though he wanted to distance himself, found it increasingly difficult to do so without causing conflict. Every time he attempted to step back, Heather became more aggressive, insisting that he was her only source of happiness. Heather's jealousy also began to surface. She would ask Nathan about his wife, accusing him of still being in love with her or questioning whether he had truly ended things with Hannah. These questions were an attempt to control him, to keep him close. Nathan, who had been trying to maintain some level of emotional distance, was now caught in a toxic cycle. Each time he thought he was breaking free, Heather would find a way to draw him back in, manipulating his emotions and exploiting his weaknesses. Heather's obsession was not just emotional, it started to take on more physical forms as well. She began showing up at Nathan's home, trying to make contact with him when he wasn't at school. At one point, she even tried to send a letter to his wife, Hannah, to explain their relationship. Her fixation on Nathan became all-consuming, and she was no longer able to distinguish between love and possession. For Heather, the idea of Nathan being with anyone else, especially his wife, was unbearable, and she began to lose touch with reality. By late 2013, Nathan Ellis knew the affair with Heather Malone had to end. The toll it was taking on his personal and professional life was becoming too great. His marriage to Hannah, though strained, still had a foundation, and Nathan had realized that continuing his relationship with Heather was threatening everything he held dear. The lies, the secrecy, and the guilt were overwhelming, and Nathan could no longer deny the damage he was causing. However, Heather was far from ready to let go. She was deeply emotionally attached to Nathan and believed their connection was meant to be. She began to see his attempts to distance himself as a personal betrayal. Her initial vulnerability had transformed into possessiveness, and Heather's expectations from the affair had shifted dramatically. What started as a brief fling for Nathan had become her entire world. Her feelings of love and desperation were wrapped in a deep sense of entitlement, and she could not fathom a life without Nathan. As Nathan began to pull away, Heather's emotional state worsened. She started showing up at his school more frequently, lingering after practices, and even visiting his office. She began texting and calling him incessantly. At first, Nathan tried to explain the situation, telling Heather that they could not continue their relationship. But every time he tried to end things, Heather would break down, begging him not to leave her. Her calls became more frantic, and she started accusing him of lying about his feelings. Nathan's guilt intensified. He didn't want to hurt her, but he could no longer live a double life. However, Heather's emotional instability was reaching new heights. When Nathan attempted to avoid her, she became paranoid and controlling. She even began questioning his loyalty to her, suspecting him of secretly seeing someone else. Nathan tried his best to reassure her that the affair was over, but Heather became fixated on the idea that if Nathan truly loved her, he would leave his wife and be with her permanently. The rejection pushed Heather further over the edge, and her obsession grew. One day, during a heated confrontation in the school parking lot, Heather confronted Nathan with tears streaming down her face, demanding to know why he was ending things. She screamed at him in front of the staff, accusing him of using her and then discarding her when it was convenient. Nathan, exhausted and feeling cornered, tried to walk away, but Heather blocked him. She was no longer the vulnerable teenager she once had been. She had transformed into someone capable of emotional manipulation and even threats. The more he resisted, the more desperate Heather became. The breaking point came when Heather threatened to expose their affair to his wife, Hannah. Nathan knew that if Heather followed through on her threat, his entire life would unravel. He tried to negotiate with Heather, asking her to keep it secret, but she refused. The affair in Heather's eyes wasn't just a mistake. It was something that had to be acknowledged, something that belonged to her. She insisted that he was making a mistake by choosing Hannah over her, and that they were meant to be together. As her emotional state deteriorated, Heather became more unpredictable, more erratic in her behavior. The final confrontation between Nathan and Heather occurred in December 2013, an emotional explosion that would forever change the course of their lives. Heather, increasingly unstable and enraged, arranged to meet Nathan at his home. By this time, Nathan had taken several steps to distance himself, including changing his phone number and blocking Heather on social media, but Heather's persistence made it impossible for him to fully escape. When Nathan reluctantly opened the door to her, Heather stood there, trembling with a mix of anger and sadness. She demanded that they talk. Nathan, feeling cornered once again, reluctantly agreed, hoping to calm her down and perhaps come to a resolution. What transpired was a heartbreaking and chaotic scene. Heather began by pleading with Nathan to understand how much she loved him, how much she had sacrificed for their relationship. She accused him of breaking her heart and ruining her life. Nathan tried to explain that he loved his wife, that his marriage wasn't perfect, but he was committed to fixing it. But Heather was beyond reason. She told Nathan that if she couldn't have him, no one would. Her words were filled with venom, and Nathan could see the depth of her pain and obsession. The argument escalated quickly. Heather became physically aggressive, grabbing Nathan's arm and pulling him towards her. Her emotions were so intense that she seemed unable to control herself. Nathan, shocked by the sudden violence, tried to push her away, telling her to calm down, but Heather was in a state of full-blown hysteria. She screamed at him, calling him every insult she could think of, blaming him for everything that had gone wrong in her life. Her anger was palpable, and her grip on reality had completely slipped. She began throwing things around the room, smashing glass objects and ripping up photos. Nathan realized just how dangerous the situation had become. In a desperate attempt to protect himself, he tried to push Heather out of the house, but she resisted. The physical struggle grew more intense. At one point, Heather grabbed a knife from the kitchen, threatening to harm herself if Nathan didn't agree to stay with her. Nathan, horrified, begged her to put the knife down, but she refused. Her actions were no longer rational. She had crossed a line from emotional manipulation to outright violence. Seeing no other option, Nathan called the police, but Heather wasn't about to let him go that easily. In her mind, this was the final chance to make Nathan hers. She threatened to kill herself if he didn't stay. The final confrontation ended with the arrival of law enforcement, but the damage was already done. After the devastating confrontation in Nathan's house, Heather's obsession only deepened. In the days following the altercation, she was consumed with a sense of abandonment and betrayal. Nathan's attempts to distance himself from her had driven Heather into a dark, irrational state. She believed that if she couldn't have Nathan, then no one else would. Her actions began to shift from emotional manipulation to outright desperation. Heather became increasingly erratic. She had been barred from contacting Nathan, but this only fueled her sense of entitlement. She began following him, showing up at his workplace, waiting near his home. She would linger around the school, hoping to catch a glimpse of him, sometimes in the middle of the night, when she believed everyone else was asleep. It became a pattern that no one in Nathan's life could ignore. Her stalking behavior turned more disturbing by the day. She started leaving letters at his door, each one more desperate than the last, demanding that Nathan recognize their bond and come back to her. Nathan, shaken by the events and aware of how deep Heather's obsession had gone, tried to seek help. He spoke to a counselor seeking advice on how to handle the situation. At the same time, he made efforts to bolster his own security, even hiring a private investigator to track Heather's movements. But Heather was already beyond any form of reasoning. The real turning point came when Heather's fixation became physically dangerous. After multiple failed attempts to contact Nathan directly, Heather decided to take matters into her own hands. She had been researching his movements, monitoring his social media to figure out when and where he would be. One evening, when Nathan was attending a local fundraiser with his wife, Heather saw it as her moment. She knew that Nathan would be vulnerable at the event. Her mind was clouded with the belief that if she could make him see the depth of her love, he would realize they were meant to be together. Heather arrived at the venue, and as she watched Nathan from a distance, her anxiety and obsession reached a boiling point. She had brought with her a gun, something she had borrowed from a friend who didn't know what she intended to do. She had no intention of leaving the event without Nathan. In her mind, this was the only way to force him to see that their connection was real. She entered the building quietly, hiding in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to confront him. She had formulated a plan in her mind. Nathan would have no choice but to be with her if she made a dramatic gesture. It was the kind of irrational thinking that had overtaken her entire being, a belief that her love for him justified the drastic steps she was willing to take. The final act of violence occurred in the most tragic and horrifying way imaginable. Heather's carefully thought-out plan to confront Nathan at the fundraiser took a catastrophic turn. When Nathan noticed her in the crowd, he froze. Heather approached him with a trembling hand, her eyes wide with desperation, and demanded that he listen to her. She told him that she couldn't live without him. She was going to make him understand how much they belonged together. Nathan, realizing the extent of Heather's instability, tried to back away, telling her to calm down, but Heather, now consumed with a mix of rage and despair, refused to let him go. In a moment of complete emotional collapse, she drew the gun from her purse and pointed it directly at him. She screamed that if she couldn't have him, no one could. Nathan's mind raced as he tried to reason with her, but Heather was too far gone. She had already crossed the line into violence. The chaos of the moment was overwhelming. The crowd around them quickly realized what was happening and panic spread. People screamed and others dove to the floor for safety. Nathan, paralyzed with fear, instinctively moved to protect himself, but Heather was faster. With one violent motion, she fired the gun. The shot rang out through the crowd, striking Nathan in the shoulder. The pain was excruciating and the noise was deafening. The room was filled with shock and horror as people scrambled for cover, but it was too late. Nathan collapsed to the ground, bleeding heavily, his wife Hannah screaming in the background. The gunshot echoed through the venue, and Heather stood there, her hands shaking as she watched him fall. The crowd, now in total panic, rushed to call 911, but Heather's mind had already spiraled into complete madness. She turned the gun on herself, saying one final desperate sentence, "If I can't have him, I don't want to live." In her final tragic act, she pulled the trigger, ending her own life before anyone could intervene. The room was filled with the sounds of people crying and yelling for help, but by the time paramedics arrived, it was already too late for both Nathan and Heather. Hannah, who had been standing nearby, was left in a state of shock, witnessing the horror of the man she loved being shot in front of her, and Heather taking her life in such a violent way. The aftermath of the tragic events that unfolded that night shook the entire community to its core. The public fallout was swift and unforgiving. The story of Nathan Ellis and Heather Malone made national news, with reporters speculating about the causes of the tragic shooting. Media outlets pounced on the affair, scrutinizing every detail of Nathan's personal life and questioning how he had let things get so out of control. Was Nathan at fault for leading Heather on? Could he have done more to prevent her from descending into madness? For Nathan, the emotional and physical wounds would take a long time to heal. He was rushed to the hospital in critical condition, his life hanging by a thread. The gunshot wound was severe, but he survived, albeit with permanent scarring. His recovery, both physical and emotional, was long and painful, but it was nothing compared to the toll it took on his family. Hannah, traumatized by witnessing the shooting, was unable to cope with the aftermath. She filed for divorce shortly after the incident, unable to reconcile the pain of the affair and the violent act that had nearly claimed her husband's life. The betrayal, coupled with the danger Heather had posed, made it impossible for her to stay in the marriage. The emotional toll on their relationship was irreparable. The community of Brookhaven, where the events unfolded, was left reeling. Teachers, students, and parents alike were left to grapple with the shocking nature of the events. The affair between Nathan and Heather, which had once been seen as a private matter, now cast a dark shadow over everyone involved. The scandal became the talk of the town, with many speculating about the motives behind Heather's obsession and the failure of those around her to recognize the signs of her deteriorating mental state. Nathan, once a respected teacher and coach, became a pariah in the eyes of some. Public opinion was divided. While some sympathized with him as a victim of Heather's obsessive behavior, others questioned his judgment and morality. How could a trusted educator allow such a situation to escalate to this level? The media had a field day, with countless articles and interviews with people who had known both Nathan and Heather. The affair was painted as a key factor in the tragedy, but the complex nature of Heather's mental health struggles was also a major point of discussion. For Heather's family, the aftermath was equally devastating. Her parents were left to mourn the loss of their daughter, who had seemingly spiraled into an uncontrollable state of obsession. They were devastated by what had happened, and public opinion was not kind to them either. Many wondered if they had missed the signs of Heather's deep emotional instability, while others blamed them for not intervening sooner. In the end, the tragedy was a stark reminder of the dangers of obsession, the thin line between love and control, and the devastating consequences of unchecked mental illness. For Nathan, his life would never be the same, and the entire community was left to pick up the pieces of a tragedy that had torn so many lives apart.